This is the Behavioral View. I'm Shannon Hill, and joining me is Nissa Van Etten. We're your hosts for candid conversations about applied behavior analysis. No gimmicks, just real talk, practical tips, and maybe a few laughs. Come on and join us. Let's have some fun. Hey everyone, would you like to get at CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words, and we'll tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Behavioral View. This is August, so that makes this episode 8 of season 4. My name is Shannon Hill. I am the editor-in-chief here at CentralReach Institute, and we have a group for you today. So, Nissa, you want to say hi?
Hey everyone, I'm Nissa Van Etten, and I am the Director of Clinical Training and CR Institute here at CentralReach.
And you are a BCBA.
I am a BCBA.
She's actually a BCBA-D.
And
correct. I guess I should say that for this episode in particular. So am I. And then we've been introducing you guys to a lot of the folks who are BCBAs and other types of clinicians on our CR team. So we're glad to bring Kara Soto today. You want to say hi, Kara?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Kara. I am a BCBA as well, but actually started my career as an SLP. And I always say it was a very happy accident that I found ABA, but so excited to be here. I'm a solution consultant manager at CentralReach, which just means I get to show people software and talk about how they do their job and how we do it at CentralReach.
Great. And our special guest today is Michelle Gage, who I have known since I guess we were both teenagers.
Yeah. Long time.
Long time.
30
so, I mean, it was like 5 years ago, right? That's all.
It was yesterday.
We're finally legal. So say hi, Michelle, and tell our audience who you are and what you do.
Hey, y'all. I'm Michelle Gage, and I am a speech language pathologist. I currently am working for AMN Healthcare, and I provide my services via teletherapy. I've been with AMN about 5 years. Prior to that, I was 18 years in the public school system in Alabama. So I'm super excited to be here. I told Shannon not to ask me any hard questions today.
It's all going to be calculus and geometry.
I should sign off now.
I was going to say I'm in trouble.
I told her just go for it.
Yeah. So if you don't mind also, Michelle, you have your own podcast. Do you want to talk about that one for just a sec?
So I recently started hosting SLP Full Disclosure that is hosted by AMN, and it has been a very fun journey. And I had Shannon on my podcast, and we talked about all things speech related and ABA related. But yeah, the podcast is out. It's been fun, and I hope you guys can listen to it.
And I can definitely endorse it. Even like I just listened to all of the episodes. Mine is not out, so it's not because I'm on it. I've been listening to every single one of them just because they're fun and engaging, and it's cool for me to kind of listen. Michelle did a couple of episodes on child development and matching goals to that. So I'm hoping to pick your brain a little bit about that today. But overall, we are talking about BCBA-SLP collaboration in this episode. But before we get into that, let's do the thing that everybody wants to know the most about, our question of the day. Thankfully, Michelle chose a good one. It's an easy one. What's your dream vacation? Who wants that one first?
I'll go first since I'm the one that chose the question. It's super easy. As soon as I saw it, I was like, I know what my answer is. My dream vacation is to go to Tahiti and stay in an overwater bungalow.
That's a good
I would
one.
go with that one. Yeah.
Which is ironic because I don't like the beach, which Shannon knows. I don't like the sand on me. I have really bad sensory issues with the sand. But
You're over the water. There's no sand.
I'm over the water. That's right. That's my dream.
She also goes to Cabo for a month every summer and doesn't touch the sand. There is that, right?
We did that.
I have so many questions.
I know. I was like, that's a good skill. How do you do that?
You stay by the pool all day long. You rent a house that has a pool and you stay by the pool all day. That's what we did. We did go to the beach when we were there a month. We went to the beach a few times because we had friends coming in. This time, Mia and I walked to the beach, took a picture, and we left. We
That
didn't
was
even
her.
take our shoes off.
Perfect.
Unbelievable. All right. What about you, Nissa? What's your dream vacation?
It has always been, and I hope to make it come true one day, but I'd love to just go to Greece and travel up and down the coast and Mediterranean food and be out, just fresh air. Lovely. And I would bring my family, which would make it not a vacation, but I want to share it with them. I would need a vacation after that vacation.
Seems like the tone of your voice changed just a little when you threw that in.
It was dreamy and then it was realistic, I think.
There was definitely that shift. Well, Kara, where are you going in your dreams?
I'm pretty simple. Michelle, I love the beach and I like the sand. And so I am happy anywhere there is a beach with extended time to be there. My kids are older, so it's nice to travel with them. I have a almost 17-year-old and 24-year-old. So it's not work to travel and it's really kind of fun to have them around. So I think any beach setting where they are and my husband is, and there's fresh seafood. I absolutely love seafood. That has to be part of the equation, but I could be happy anywhere with those things.
Well, it sounds like maybe you and Michelle could go to Tahiti, and Nissa and I can cover the Mediterranean because mine is the month in Italy. So I could see us bumping into each other along we could meet in the middle of the Mediterranean, I guess, Nissa.
Oh,
I do
absolutely.
need to clarify. I like the beach. I like to look at the beach. I like to see the beach, and I like to hear the beach.
You
Just
don't want
like
this to
feel the
Smell
beach.
the beach. I like to smell the salt in the air, but I don't want to touch it.
I understand,
Sand is messy and uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, let's dive in just a little bit into the reason that we're here together, and that's collaboration. And I will say, Michelle, do you know when the episode that you and I have already recorded together is going to be released?
I do not.
Okay.
Not yet.
So we're basically, we did you do mine, I'll do yours trade-off thing. So we're going to try not to repeat things that were there, but we'll drop the links when we know when that episode is coming out and kind of cross-share this information. So I'm going to try not to repeat things that we've already talked about there. But I kind of wanted to pick up with, we talked about like collaboration and working together and some things that get in the way of that on Michelle's podcast. But I want to kind of pick you guys' brains on situations, experiences that you've had where you collaborated well with a BCBA or an SLP, whichever one you are not or were not at the time, Kara, in your case. Anybody got any good stories about, situations where that went really well and why you think that is?
I have a very clear memory, and I'm old, so I have been around for a long time and worked in what I call the wild, wild west of ABA when it was first starting in the late 90s. Not first starting, but first getting introduced to families. And I just remember a lot of the clients I was working with were little. They were 2 and 3-year-olds. And I was shocked that we were tasked with helping these children learn how to talk, but nobody in the ABA field had a background in speech development. But at the time, it was very clear, like, we're here to work on behavior. The speech therapist will work on language development. Everybody kind of does their own job. And we had this little girl we worked with. She was 2. She was very impacted. She had a lot of pretty intense behaviors, which we later found out she had severe food allergies to about 90% of the food she ate. So she was just in a lot of pain. But it prevented us from ever really getting past some of these behaviors. And she had an amazing speech therapist who just would not give up on her. She couldn't do sign language. She didn't have the fine motor control to do that. She couldn't even grab, where at the time PECS was kind of coming into being. And so she really had a hard time even pulling things off of a board. And we on the behavior side were just so focused on trying to work through these behaviors so that we could teach her something. And her speech therapist kind of stumbled upon the fact that she loved letters, and she took that and ran with it. This little girl started spelling before she was 3. And the speech therapist just came up with this whole communication system based on her love of letters. And I don't think it was anything that the ABA crew would have ever gotten to, because we were just so focused on trying to help her be comfortable and receive what we were doing. But this speech therapist would just not take no for an answer. And I think so many other professionals that worked with this little girl threw up their hands and were like, oh, we don't know what to do with her. And it was my very first, very clear memory of, we let the speech therapist take that and run with it. And then she taught the rest of the ABA team kind of how to develop it and continue that usage. But it was like, I still get goosebumps thinking about that little girl. And I think so many people would have given up on teaching her something, where that speech therapist was the one who really just broke through, took it, and then taught us how to run with it.
I love that. It's a beautiful story.
Yeah, that little girl's now 30 years old. So
Wow.
it's been a long time. She's probably not quite 30, but getting close. Yeah.
I like that story. I think I don't have one particular story like that, like yours, Kara, but I've worked in a number of multidisciplinary clinics where there were also speech and OT services. And I think it was just a nice collaboration and everyone getting together for the purpose of the client or the child. But early in my career, like Kara is mentioning, a lot of my early learners had SLPs first. So speech and language came kind of before ABA came. And this was before, insurance reform had passed, and I was in California as well. So a lot of my role as a young therapist was just going to speech sessions and observing and picking up on what they were doing and how they were, a quick session, but building a ton of rapport and getting a ton of interaction with the learner. And then I would go home and kind of carry over those skills in the home setting. So I've always had a ton of respect for speech therapists, really got to go into their sessions and observe. And as a young therapist, learned from them and how they modeled and interacted, as I was also obtaining my experience as, in ABA. So it really did help how I kind of grew as a behavior analyst.
Yeah. I think for me, if I could think back to one story, it was working with a little boy in Alabama. He came into us at 6 years old, had never been in school before. The pediatrician kept telling mom there was nothing wrong with him. And he was on the spectrum, but we were having a terrible time with his behaviors in the classroom. And we had a BCBA come in, and within the first day, she was able to identify, which is so funny, that he was terrified of the vacuum cleaner. And that's really all it was. And the teacher had a vacuum cleaner, one of the big, and it was a school system. So it was one that had been around for 30 years. So it was huge and it was really loud. But she didn't use it every day. She didn't use it when the kids were there, obviously, but it stayed in her classroom and it was visible. And the BCBA was like, I think he's afraid of something. And just started through the process, found out that it was the vacuum cleaner and he was terrified of the vacuum cleaner. We moved the vacuum cleaner out of the room and it was a completely different child.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It's the stories that you guys were telling have to do with not necessarily so much what a speech therapist is trained in, not necessarily what a BCBA is trained in, but individual characteristics of somebody who's just like, I will figure this out, roll this up and get in there and focus on it. I think that that's telling in a lot of ways about how you get along with people and what kind of things how we can meet in the middle on just working together and not being so siloed. For me personally, I don't have a recollection of not working well with an SLP. Like I just don't have that. And I have a favorite SLP that I've worked with. This one was in my wedding, so obviously she's my favorite SLP. But Jaina, if you're listening, you're still my favorite, even though I don't think either of us is doing that work anymore, because Kara, as old as you might think you are, there's me. But it was that too. It was exactly that, within that school district, we had both she was fully employed there and I was a consultant there for so long. And we just developed this trust and respect for each other's expertise and knowledge. And more than that, though, investment and real interest in the kids and helping them with whatever it is that was their life obstacle, right? And we had so many good collaborations just because of coming to it with that mindset. And I think that's what you're touching on too, Nissa, that it's about what you're here for
Mhm.
and that you don't need to be the savior, right?
Right.
And the expert. Um, all right. So before we kind of transition, it's time to do a secret word for our CEU seekers. And our first secret word is sandbox, SANDBOX, because we're talking about sandbox playing together issues today. Sandbox. All right. So I think that, as I mentioned earlier, when I was listening to Michelle's podcasts, the other episodes, I was really intrigued about you going into such detail when you were talking about child development.
Mhm.
One of the struggles that is constantly being talked about, how we're going to work out in the field of behavior analysis, is that ironically, we don't get a lot of training in child development.
Which
Um,
is me.
Shocking.
yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
really. Now, I think that a lot of people who go on to become behavior analysts might have been like in psychology as an undergrad or something, communication disorders as an undergrad, and they got some of that, but not to the extent. Like you even said a sentence that I heard you say, which
Gosh.
was like, "Don't expect children to pay attention." It's like the 1 minute per age is how long you should expect them
Yeah.
to pay attention for, and I'm like, hmm. 53 years old? Never heard that before. Okay,
That's what
cool. So
you can't expect a 2-year-old to sit down and do something, with full attention for 10 minutes. It's just, I mean, it's just not going to happen.
yeah. So one of the things that I think that we can do when we are collaborating that a lot of people's minds go to immediately is when we are setting goals that are communicative in nature, working out the relationship between what goes into the domain of the speech pathologist versus what goes into the domain of the BCBA sometimes causes some friction. So I'm just curious about you guys, how have you kind of worked through that in the past, or what is your working philosophy on it if you got one?
I'll just say you said something earlier, Shannon, about we're not the saviors as BCBAs. And I think just taking that pressure off, I've always felt so much relief, even though I have a lot of that speech background. When I'm in my ABA role, I'm focused over there and, pulling from both sides of my brain sometimes isn't the easiest, but just knowing there's someone else who is focused on that part of that child's development, it's just so pressure relieving to me. It's like, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to be all the things. I don't have to know all the things. And then acknowledging that too, I think, there's been, and again, I have seen this collaboration come a long way over the course of my career. And it makes me so happy because I'm like, this is a beautiful marriage. There is overlap, and that's really nice because we can meet in the middle, but you can bring what you know and I can bring what I know, and it all works so well together. Um, but I think there has to be an acknowledgement of, yeah, we don't have to know all the things, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think Shannon and I talked on my podcast about how, I've also been around quite some time. I'm pretty old myself. So back in the day when you heard in the school system that a BCBA was coming in, it was just automatic, heart racing. Oh my gosh, somebody's going to come in, they're going to tell me what to do. But I think just acknowledging, I think obviously the maturity in my career, I've grown and I understand that I don't know the answer to everything. And I think that was one of the questions of the day. What advice would you give your younger self? And that would be my advice. It's okay to not know the answer and to rely on that person in that field. Like you guys are so knowledgeable and just looking at, what is your end goal? What do we want them to do communication wise? And what's getting in the way of that happening? Where is that child functioning cognitively, overall developmentally, and how can we get there together? And I think that, that's important.
I love what you were just saying though about the confidence to say I don't know,
Mhm.
because and maybe you guys relate. I think the older I get, the more confident I am in saying I have no
Absolutely. I agree. I do not know what you're talking about, and I don't know. And that's
Yep.
okay. But I will find out. I know how to go about finding out the answer, but it's okay to say, I don't know. And there have
Yeah.
been a lot of cases that I've worked on by myself with BCBAs, with other professionals, where I'm just like, I don't know. I've got one right now that I literally don't know. And that's okay.
It is. And I think that is definitely something that comes with maturity. And our field is very young. The majority of people in behavior analysis have been certified less than 5 years. And so we didn't talk about that piece of it, is that this is a developmental trajectory for a professional too. There's nothing abnormal about someone who's very young in their career being afraid of looking like they don't know what they're doing and maybe extending a little bit more than they should. That probably shouldn't be something we do developmentally, but there's something about that that you have to mature into
Right.
to be able to be confident enough to say, I need help.
I like to approach it with humility. I think I think about all the cases where I've been introduced to an SLP by the parent via email. I want you to get to know the speech and language pathologist. We're about to have an AAC device or PECS. And I think that first email is always, can we hop on a call? Let's have a conversation, and introducing myself saying, this is the client I'm serving in this location. I don't come with them to speech. I don't know how they're doing in school. I'm serving them in home or in a clinic. So I think there's a lot of being humble and saying, I only know how they operate here. Here are the goals that we've written, but I would love your approval because you see them in another capacity and you are their speech and language pathologist. I think there's a lot to be said in that, being humble and being honest and saying, I don't know all the answers. Like, is this an appropriate goal for this particular learner? We're targeting, I know I've taught a lot of WH questions to learners, and a lot of speech and language pathologists also teach them. And when I meet with my clients, SLPs, it's a lot of, I love that you're working on that. How are you teaching that? How is it going? Can I come in and observe so that we can replicate that in the center? And if those conversations could be open and honest for the best interest of each client, then I think that we'll be in the right direction. But there's also this level of, some of our colleagues who maybe have just passed the exam and it's like, I'm ready. I'm going to take this caseload. I'm going to manage it. I wrote the goals and I'm ready to attack this program. And as we build our careers, stepping back and say, why didn't that go so well? Perhaps I should have collaborated better so that I could have taught those WH questions in a way they could learn them.
You said something that that made me think. You were talking about, you might work with a client in a clinic. You may be servicing him in their home. The speech pathologist is probably in the school system. And those environments are all so very different.
Absolutely.
And sometimes the goals can be the same, but the way you attack those goals are going to be very, very different. The behaviors, everything are going to be different in the home versus a clinic setting versus a classroom setting where you've got, 8 or 10 or maybe even more kids running around, and the teachers, you've got 2 or 3 teachers in the classroom. So a lot of times it's been very difficult for me as a speech pathologist who has a child who is receiving those BCBA services in a clinic or maybe in their home, because the parent's like, well, they do that at home, or they do it this way, at home or in the clinic. And I'm like, well, the teacher's got a lot of other lemons in the pot over here, and there's a lot more going on. So even though you may be working toward the same goal, I think you're exactly right. I agree 100%. Just how does that work? How are you working on that goal in the clinic or in the home so that we can replicate that in all settings?
Sometimes there's some annoying obstacles to being able to do something that obvious, right? Like all the different rules about where a behavior analyst can be from state to state and funding to funding stream, and things that kind of get in the way of that sort of effective collaboration. Because honestly, like, as you're listening, the common sense answer is, well, the behavior analyst should go to the classroom and take a look and see how they can adapt that plan for people to use in the classroom. It's not always going to be possible for that to happen. So you just kind of gave me a bit of an idea, Michelle. I wonder, like, how do we collaborate when we are siloed into different service systems? Has anybody got any experience with that?
I don't have any experience with it, but when you said that, I was thinking, look what we're doing. I'm in Mississippi, you're Mississippi, 45 minutes away. Someone said they were in Texas. So what about video conferencing? Just observing. I mean, you're just there. You don't have to leave the school. You can hop on a session. You could do it after hours. You could do it during the school day. Maybe observing.
If it's allowed.
If it's allowed. Like you were saying, you've got 42 forms that you have to sign. You need to talk to the BCBA.
Yeah.
I think too, being open to there's more than one way to attack the same problem. I think that's one of the biggest obstacles I would run into earlier in my career is, well, everybody has to do it this one way. And the speech therapist might have their opinion of what that one way is, and the BCBA might have a very different opinion. And just being open-minded that, hey, just because I wouldn't have thought of that, but it's working, maybe there's several ways to look at this one problem.
Flexibility.
Oh, flexibility. Yes.
Looking at the big picture.
Yes.
Accepting ideas from others. Yes.
And those are all things that I think that earlier in the history of ABA, we've had a struggle with, and we talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think on your podcast, Michelle. I do think it is something that that we are getting better about as a field, not only in collaborative contexts, but even within our own world that there is more than one way to do things. So, for example, Michelle, for a long, long time, and probably like you and I, Michelle and I, by the way, worked together. That's how we met at an adult residential facility. People with intellectual disabilities way back in the early 1990s.
Yes. A long time ago.
A long time ago. And there were things that we did at that point that's just what you did because that's all that was known. So if someone was engaging in annoying attention-seeking behavior, then extinction. And that's it. Whether that was escape extinction or that was attention extinction, whatever, you just had to do it. And it was miserable for everybody. And so now behavior analysis is starting to come around and say, sometimes you give attention when they are seeking attention and it gets better. You don't always have to go straight to these extremes. And so I feel like so much goes on the shoulders of the behavior analysis community in the past being inflexible. And maybe that's accounted for why people feel sad when we walk into the building. But I hope that we're getting better. I think that we're getting better. I'm not 100% sure that that's going to be ever all gone, but I think we're trying.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think it's definitely getting better with more BCBAs out there and the school districts having more access to them. And like you were saying earlier, the insurance and more parents are tapping into those services outside of the school system. And so they are involved in that client's life. And so it's bleeding over into the school system. And I think it is definitely getting better for sure.
But I think the explosion of multidisciplinary services, we see so many clinics now offering all of the things in one spot. And so maybe we're raising up BCBAs to just know that is normal, that collaboration is just part of what we do in this field. That makes me happy because my favorite places to work have always been where we collaborated. So I think if we're headed in that direction and they come fresh out of their coursework and that's all they know, then that's what they'll like to do.
That is an amazing point. You're exactly right. Yeah. Because I do think that is, and when I said that I've never had a problem with an SLP, I think that's why. Like I grew up in a multidisciplinary system, and I say grew up because I was a kid when I started, not as young as Michelle was, but I was a baby. And everything was multidisciplinary. And the idea that people with different credentials from you would be approving whether or not your plan gets implemented, that was just a part of it. And they weren't looking at it from the technical side, but they were looking at it from the human side, the social validity and the humanity of it all. And I think that we definitely benefit from having those extra sets of eyes on us. Michelle, I kind of wanted to get you talking about something else, though, that helps us in collaboration. I find myself frequently explaining the difference between a behavior analyst and a psychologist when I'm working with people who are from different professions and families and teachers and such. Um, there's a differences between SLPs, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's different philosophical foundations and that sort of thing that might make it different how you talk about things or think about things. Is that true?
I would say yes, probably so. I think as you start your career, you just develop this. My philosophy is very just, it's basic. It's almost, and to me, I say it's common sense. But in my philosophy in speech pathology is child development. You can't just look at that speech area. You can't just look at that expressive and receptive language because there are so many other things that are going to impact that. So having that knowledge in gross motor, fine motor, cognitive, social and emotional, all of those areas, having that knowledge helps me build that speech and language. So that's my philosophy, just kind of a whole language. And, birth to 3 is my heart. It's not really where I'm working right now. But that's my heart, is that child development piece, because you really have to have a good knowledge of what's typical before you can say, that's atypical. That's not quite typical. So I think that's where I learned early on. You were saying, learning from other professionals. I had worked with some of the most brilliant occupational therapists and physical therapists that I could ever imagine. And I've learned so much from them. And it's amazing what gross motor can do to help that language development, bringing that gross motor piece in. So that's my philosophy. It's just going at it from, let's look at everything and how everything is developing, and understanding that when these kids are developing, they're just like sponges and everything is moving and they're learning. And I told a family the other day, and I thought this was a really good analogy, so I did give myself a little pat on the back. But just imagine being 15 or 18 months old, and every day you wake up, the world is there's something new. If I hear the garbage truck, I know what that is. If I hear the washer buzz or the dryer buzz, I know what that is. A phone ring. If I smell popcorn or if I smell something different, I know what those things are. But for kiddos, for little bitties, they don't know. And so that everything that they encounter every day is different. So can you imagine getting up and every day not knowing what a sound was or textures? I'm sitting in a Sherpa chair. I know what that feels like. I have soft blankets, but we know what all those things are. So just taking a step back and going, okay, what must it be like for this kid experiencing this world every day? And what can we do to make it a little less, tragic for them and a little less, scary? So I look at, my philosophy is, let's just take it from a global developmental perspective and move forward from there, and incorporating all of those different areas. And a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people are just like, hey, I'm a speech pathologist. We're working on expressive and receptive language. We're doing articulation, and that's it. And in my opinion, you can't really do that.
Do you guys have a problem with people wanting to just go through a checklist of skills? We have that problem.
I was going to say, it feels very similar to what we see in some of the behavior analysts that we work with as they're learning and growing. But I'm going to use that forever now. Michelle, your example of just like, imagine waking up as a little one, and, and I have a niece who's 2 at this time. So it's so fun to see the world, right? The sounds and the tastes. Just, she was here a little bit ago, and we walked into the Austin Library, and she looked around and looked at me and said, "Auntie, books." And, my kids are teens, and they're just like, we're at the library going to go find books. And it was just like, look at this amazing place, and there are books everywhere. It's just so fun to watch that development. But I think there is this exact level of understanding child development, being around children. One of my mentors, Dr. Partington, used to always say, if you don't know children, go to your local church preschool, go to your daycare, and just hang out around little ones up until they're 10. Just get to know what other children can do, so that as a behavior analyst, you can support identifying goals that are age appropriate.
Right. I definitely became a better speech pathologist after I became a mother. And I was also working in early intervention at that time. Um, and Mia was an infant, and I was working with birth to 3. So, they typically don't get into speech till 12 to 18 months. And it was at that point when she got to that age and she was a typically developing child that I realized how behind some of my kids were, because she was, 9 months old and she was walking. Like, I've got a picture of her with an Easter basket and it's almost as tall as she is. And just the things that she was able to do, and it didn't dawn on me until that point when I was watching her go through those developmental stages, and she was, sometimes a year younger than some of the kiddos that I was working with. So I definitely became a better speech pathologist after I became a mother.
And I think
And I would
go
go ahead.
ahead, Shannon.
No, you go ahead, Kara.
I think what both of you are saying just takes me back to perspective. I only have the perspective that I have. And sometimes another professional is going to have a totally different perspective that informs my perspective. And if I don't reach out or I don't spend time with them, I'm only going to know what I know, which
Right.
number one keeps me siloed, but number two impacts, my learner and how effective I can be in that situation.
Yeah. And a lot of the time that we spent in Michelle's podcast was talking about the thinking about it in the reverse. Because, as I said, we met in adult services. And for me, knowing a lot of people with developmental disabilities who are over 21, I know a lot of people who are over 31. I know a lot of people who are over 81 with developmental disabilities. And being able to see what happens, like how much harder it is to intervene on certain missing skills as they get older, and being able to project forward, has really informed a lot for me on choosing skills. And I want to back up to something I said and Nissa said. I don't want everybody mad at us. Um, it is not necessarily the fault of young behavior analysts that they are clinging to things like the ABLES and and using those as goals instead of the assessments that they are. The reason for that is that our field is so young. We haven't really developed all of the tools that we need yet in order to assess. And one of the reasons that the ABLES is so popular is that they did come at it with a comparison and talk about these are the skills. It's not perfectly ordered. We're not claiming that it is, but these are skills that we know are part of child development. And we can give you some norms on what that looks like for typically developing kids so that you have a comparative point. But we do, because we are lacking so much training in child development, and our tools are not norm referenced, they're almost always criterion referenced or self-referenced. The act of choosing goals is difficult. It's probably one of the harder tasks for a behavior analyst at this point. So I think that is one place that this collaborative effort can really show fruit.
Yes. Let me ask you this. When you guys do BCBAs have access to the multidisciplinary psychoeducational reports where you
Yes.
get all of that information? How much emphasis do you guys put on looking at that IQ score? Because that is something I actually have a podcast. I'm sure you heard it with my friend Katie Shannon,
Yeah.
and talking about the IQ
Hmm.
testing, and that is something that I learned when I was working in Alabama, that IQ scores, if you have an IQ of 100, which is right in the middle, my language score is going to be right around that. And I was pretty late in my career before I realized that. And I'm seeing you guys shaking your heads. If I the only one that didn't know that, like, I felt so dumb when I was like, wait a minute, every language test I get, if I get a 98, the IQ might be 102 to 94 to 102. Like, they were always right within, and sometimes they were right on the dot. And I think once I started bringing that piece in and looking at not just the language testing, what was my language score? Was I a 70? Was I an 85? Was it 62? And once I started bringing, and I know we said we weren't going to talk about math, But once I started bringing those numbers in and realizing that those IQ scores, that gives you so much information on the child's innate ability to learn. And I think setting goals from that point and explaining parents, because when you're in those meetings, the psychometrist is just throwing out those numbers and the parents are shaking their head and they're like, yes, yes, yes. But they don't know what that means. And if you've got an IQ of 60, being able to answer, making inferences and drawing conclusions and all of that in the classroom, that's going to be hard. Those multi-step mathematical equations, that's going to be hard. So I think setting those goals and looking at it from that perspective and going like to the very bottom, this is where our IQ is. This is where our language is. Where can we go from there? What can we expect this child? Because when we set those goals too high, and I think that's something that has happened so frequently, those goals are too high and then they're not meeting them. And then the parents are frustrated, therapists are frustrated, the children are frustrated, everyone's frustrated. But if we look at it from that back to that developmental standpoint.
Okay, so a couple of things are flying through my head as you're talking. First of all, did I test your IQ when I was doing
You
this?
did. And I remember specifically sitting in that apartment on Skyline Drive. I lived on one end and Shannon lived on the other. And I remember you giving me an IQ test. And this is what I remember. It must have been one of the puzzle things where I had to match do you have to match some stuff in an IQ test? And I couldn't do it. And I was fiddling with it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I did it. And you said, it's fine. The time's up. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, whatever. I remember I was so defeated. I was like, oh my gosh.
Nice for you. If Lucy Leslie is listening, I probably should have failed that one then because I should not have sent that to you. Okay. So I've got a lot of feelings about IQ tests. But yes, back in the day, we would give a PPVT if someone did not have verbal ability, and that would be our approximation of an IQ. Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which is a speech therapy thing. And yes, the verbal IQ should be very similar to what you're getting in your speech assessments as well. There are some issues though especially with autism in particular, and people, kids who English is not their native language, they're being tested in it, that sort of thing. There's always going to be some exceptions, right? But so much of that falls on the shoulders of the psychometrist to make sure that they are choosing the correct tests for that. But I like those. Yeah, I like reports more for the breakdown. So those sub-skills where you can see maybe working memory is really strong, but problem solving is really weak. When you look at all of that, that gives you a lot of insight into what their strengths and weaknesses are and how you can build, and it kind of pushes you towards other things that you can assess to get some skills that you could actually be working with. I love those multidisciplinary reports. I'm glad that you brought them up. I have talked about them a lot. I will say the speech one is the hardest one for me to read because all those squiggles and orders and things like that.
Phonetics, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. And we talked about that in my podcast with Katie, is that those subtests, and I think that it is so frequently overlooked. I know it is by speech pathologists because speeches are just like, I'm looking at the language. This is what their expressive was. This is what their receptive was. And we're going from there. But you're right. You've got to look at what was the working memory? What was their processing like? What was all of this stuff like? Because that is going to play a big role in your goal selection moving forward.
When I think as behavior analysts, and again, because of my experience in the different settings I've worked in and learning about reading previous records and how significant that was, I think there's also a component where behavior analysts should need to be taught to do such a thing. I think that, at least in practice that I'm seeing in current day, it's the Vineland. It's typically sent out via, some digital source to an email, comes in, cut and paste it into your treatment plan, because that's what we're mainly writing if we're not working in schools. And sometimes it's not even reviewed. So I do review treatment plans and mentor BCBAs. And my first question is, well, did you read the Vineland? It has the subskills. Did you identify areas of weakness, areas that you could focus on further? And a lot of them have said, I don't know how to read one. I don't know what I'm reading. I don't know what to focus on. So I think that is an area in which to support collaboration and working with your SLP and say, can you discuss your assessment with me? What did you see? And this is where we can learn and do better in understanding how to read all of these different methods of assessment beyond the ones that we administer that are mainly criteria referenced, to do a holistic approach to each child, adult, client that comes into our care. And then the other piece that I want to say is that behavior analysts are stretched so thin these days. I think we all know, especially if they're working in a clinic setting or clinic, home, and school, right? They're driving from location to location, and even that minimal hour that they should be doing a background check, which again, like I'm saying, it's minimal. We need to spend more time doing records review, but that's not billable time. So it causes one of those components of, am I going to do that at night during my charting time? When am I going to spend the time to review? And is there a way for digital, platforms to highlight areas of focus for me? Or is there a way for it to pull that out of a report and say, this is your learner, they're coming into your care. Here are some areas you should look at and consider when you go and evaluate them. I think there's a lot to be said in how we are trained to review different assessments beyond the ones that we administer ourselves, and then using that holistic approach and then socially significant care via collaboration to say, okay, I've done my due diligence. I have an idea of who this individual is, and I'm going to select appropriate goals after all of that.
Sounds like a CEU set.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one thing to read it, and you also have to understand it, like you said. I mean, I could read a report all day long. I mean, I've got great reading skills, but am I understanding what all that means?
Yeah. And another thing is, and I have a talk that I do on the differences between multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary, which is very wordy, but where we talk about those reports often are just reading through it can tell you a lot about the functioning of the team. Because I have read reports that are compiled where there are very clearly report the same behavior is being mentioned by two different professionals in exact opposites. One might say it's a strength, one might say it's a weakness. What does that mean? I mean, that doesn't mean either assessment is invalid, but it does, if it's just left hanging in that report, mean that our team isn't communicating, because that is something that if I was got that as a parent, I'd be mad. I would be angry. Like, who's not paying attention? And so when I assess something as a strength and you assess it as a weakness, we should be coming together to say, how are you measuring that? What does that mean? What is the perspective from you on that? And that helps us out a lot. I mean, I have seen it listed like things like ability to self-advocate, for example. That somebody might think that is a weakness, and somebody might say they're very good at self-advocating. But one person is talking about, I'm self-advocating because I like to eat grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch and I'm demanding that I have it. And another one is saying, well, they don't tell anybody when somebody's picking on them.
Right.
I mean, that's a very broad example. But anyway, I have a lot to say about interdisciplinary reports. I do wish everybody would read them, and I wish we would read them before they went out to the family and work through those places where we may be unclear.
And that's when you said, if I were a parent and I got that, I would be so upset. Unfortunately, I think so many times the parents they're so overwhelmed and they're so inundated, and they've got a psychology report, they've got a speech language report, they may have a report from you guys, OT, PT, all these people have written reports. And then if it's combined into one report, it could be, 20 pages long. And I think they're so overwhelmed that those are the things right there that get overlooked. And you're right. It does need to be discussed beforehand.
Well, and they're also coming into a meeting with everybody.
Okay.
Year one, and it feels very outnumbered for most of them, I would imagine.
It's very intimidating.
My son never had an IEP, but I got to where I was calling meetings with teachers before school to prevent problems that were foreseeable. And so I would walk into those meetings because I had been an IEP team member for 20 years by the time I was doing this for him. I would walk into those meetings like I owned them. Like, I called this meeting and we're here to talk about what I want to talk about. Here's my agenda. I passed out paper to them, and just the looks on everybody's faces, they were like, okay, yes,
Yes,
thank you.
ma'am. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, and it felt great for me, but I can imagine that most people do not do that and have an entirely different experience. What do you guys do to make those families feel more confident and participate more meaningfully in those meetings?
For me, I think it's how I write my reports. I have read, you know, thousands of reports in my career, and sometimes they are so technical, and we're using, acronyms, and we're using all of this stuff and syntax, semantics, morphology, and all these things that are, I know what they mean. But I tried to write my reports. If you read my report, another professional, I hope that they would understand that I'm not writing this report for you, because I know if I give you a report, you're going to be able to read it and you're going to know what it means, aside from the squiggles, Shannon, and the articulation stuff. But again, even with that, even when I'm doing articulation testing, when I use my phonetic symbols, I always just put, for the SH, I always just put SH out there, because I don't expect a parent to understand what that means. So I write my reports where they're very easy to read in very layman's terms. This is what it means. I'm not talking about phonological processes. I may say phonological processes, but then I'm explaining what that means. So that's what I do. And when I explain my test scores, I always have my bell curve. I always give visuals, and I think that helps parents to understand. When
Oh,
they
we love a chart. We love a chart.
Oh, yeah. I know. Everybody I think we all love charts.
Visuals, they're helpful.
They're very
They're so helpful.
I even I have one that I put in my reports, just so that when they get home and they read it, they can say, "Okay, what did that 74 mean?
Yeah.
Okay, oh, wait, where was it? Is that good or bad?" Because the 74 in class, I mean, that's passing, but is that really good here,
I
Yeah.
wish you could write reports my parents are reading, Michelle, because my first thought is, when you said going through reports with parents, is the disappointment and lack of hope. And it just almost like this burden just gets heavier and heavier on them as they get further through the report. Because sometimes, as you mentioned earlier, Shannon, when we're talking about autism, taking assessments and tests, often what we see as that final score is not representative of what they really can do. It's hard for parents to understand that when they see it on a piece of paper. My child has an IQ of 40. And so for them, they just fast forward to, what's that going to mean? What is the future going to look like? And now I just don't have any hope. And so as I'm thinking about helping parents understand reports, they really just want to know, what are we going to do? Can we get past the numbers and you just tell me, like, what is the future going to look like starting right now? How are we going to start attacking these things? Because, Michelle, I've read some reports that are pretty discouraging and not written at all the way that you write yours, where it is hard to understand, and the parts they do understand are pretty bleak. And so I think just helping parents kind of gather, okay, yes, this is what the test said, but here's what the plan is. And can we start somewhere and just know that it's going to be a journey, but it's not your child is going to have an IQ of 40 the rest of their life.
Yeah.
I like you, Michelle, as my confidence grew, my reports came down in reading level and down in jargon and that sort of thing, because there was and always has felt like there's two audiences for every report you write. The person you're writing it for, whose life it's about, but there's always this there's a surveyor that's going to read it. There's an approval body, or there's a behavior analyst who's coming in behind me who's going to read it. And I have had behavior analysts come behind me and say, "What is this? This does not look like this does not look like an FBA report. This does not look like a BIP." And that pressure is real sometimes. Kara, Nissa, how have you landed on this with report writing? Are you writing two versions? Are you trying to bridge both worlds, or are you just abandoning your critics and writing for the parents?
I think I've said in a number of our podcasts that I always, and I train it this way too in the courses I teach and in my mentorship, that we're the artists who are painting a picture of this individual, right? That if it's a funding source, an IEP team, they'll never meet that individual. They're going to get to look at the art. And you as the clinician are the artist who is painting this image, this likeness of who this person is and what is important in terms of progress for this period of time. And then from the parent perspective, you are taking in those records, the reviews, the parent training hours, and getting to know their child and portraying them in this painting. So for me, I write it from the perspective, and I work in mainly insurance funded programs. So that's how I write all of my treatment plans for the criteria that are required, but with the clinical recommendations that I believe are best fit. So I know some clinicians may write it because they know it'll be approved from this funding source if I write it in this manner. I write it to fit the criteria, but in what I believe is best for that client. And then something I've done since as a newly certified behavior analyst, I would submit without sharing with the parent. And then I learned really quickly how unacceptable that is, right? It was just like, it's due on this date. And so it was write it really quickly and submit. And then I learned that's absolutely unacceptable because, again, it is parent consent before we submit to any funding source, which is their insurance-based program. But I have always taken that exact same treatment plan and then had a full 2 to 3 hours, so multiple parent training sessions to cover the entire treatment plan to say, when we met, this is what I interpreted as a goal. Here's how I wrote it, and here's how it's going to be measured. But do you agree on this goal? Is this appropriate? Is this socially significant to your family? And even today, when I work with different learners, I have a number of learners where this was the focus. So I had a learner where it was conversations and board games and WH questions and inferences, like you were saying, Michelle. And then we rapidly saw as he matured, it became he would elope and leave the home to look for license plates and, build relationships. The whole program had to shift to safety, understanding strangers, staying in close proximity. And in that shift, I had numerous conversations with mom and sharing the goals and saying, okay, I'm removing this goal. We're no longer doing board games. We are now going to talk about when I go to the grocery store, if I can't find my mom, if I can't find my sister, here's what I do. So I think, again, in the whole theme and spirit of collaboration, it does require us as behavior analysts to really know our clients, to meet with speech and language and say, we were working on WH with you. We've now moved that because he got out and we found him down the road and whatnot. So
all the pressure's back on speech now for the WH questions.
I love that analogy that you're the artist painting a picture of a child, and you're right. And I think that that is so important because we do sometimes have to give some pretty bleak news, like you were saying. And not all times are we giving, they're doing great and they're wonderful. So I love that.
I think there's so much pressure, especially right now, on BCBAs to write reports based on what the funding source wants to see, that we make the appropriate case to get the services that we know are needed. And in the back of your mind, you're like, okay, now and so what you said is so true. It's the most important part of that process is to sit down with the parents and explain what's in that report. Because to a parent, what we write in that report could sound very bleak, could sound even confusing to them. But meeting with them and talking through those things and explaining why it's in there, I think is the biggest key.
I have been negligent in doing my business. So secret word number 2 is development, DEVELOPMENT. Well, guys, we are running up on 1 hour now. So I want to just go ahead and say thank you to everybody for joining us. I think we could keep talking for hours on end about all these topics. And we will continue actually at CR. Nissa and I are doing a webinar on multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. I don't know how we've landed on what we're going to call it yet, but that is going to be at the end of this month. So watch your emails for information about that. And Michelle will share when her podcast on collaboration with BCBAs comes out.
Yes.
Anything else we need to know that you have coming out soon, Michelle?
I'm going to be doing a solo podcast on when I did my 2 about child development, birth to 18 months and then 18 to 36 months. I kept finding myself in the midst of those. You probably heard me saying, but if they're not doing this, then this is what we need to do. So I'm doing a whole episode on just when things are not looking like they're supposed to look. We're going to call it red flags, maybe.
I
Things
love
to
it.
I
for.
do too.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and what do we do at that point?
Secret word number 3 is camp, CAMP. So, as I said, I'm listening to it just for the fun of listening to Michelle talk because she's super entertaining. But also, I'm learning a lot. So, those of you who want to know more about early child development, definitely tune in and listen to those especially. I think you'll really love them. But for now, I guess that we will say goodbye and we will see everyone on the next episode of the Behavioral View.
Thank y'all
Thanks.
so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching this episode of the Behavioral View.